The night I opened my door and saw Apache riders waiting outside my cabin, I knew helping that girl had changed everything. Daniel Carter had lived alone in the valley for nearly 10 years, long enough for the wind, the cattle, and the slow rhythm of the land to become the only company he needed. His small ranch sat between two low ridges about half a mile from a narrow creek that carried fresh mountain water through the dry prairie. Most days were quiet and predictable. At sunrise, Daniel checked his horses, rode the fence lines, and watched the sky the way every rancher in the frontier learned to do. That afternoon had started no different. The sun was dropping low when Daniel rode down toward the creek to make sure the water level had not fallen after a week of dry heat. The prairie grass moved gently in the wind, and the mountains beyond the valley were glowing gold under the late evening light. But as Daniel guided his horse along the rocky bank, something unusual caught his eye near a cluster of stones by the water. At first he thought it might be a piece of cloth caught in the brush. Then he realized the shape was moving. Daniel dismounted slowly and stepped closer. Lying beside the creek was a young Apache girl, no older than 16. Her clothes were dusty from travel and her breathing was weak, as if she had been trying to reach the water but had run out of strength before she could make it. When she saw Daniel, her eyes opened wide with fear. The frontier had taught both sides to expect the worst from strangers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Daniel could see she was exhausted and struggling just to stay conscious. He also knew something else. If members of her tribe found her near his ranch, they might assume he had caused her suffering. That kind of misunderstanding had started more than one deadly feud across the frontier. Daniel stood there listening to the quiet sound of the creek moving past the rocks while the girl tried to push herself up but could barely lift her head. He had two choices. He could leave her there and ride back to his ranch before anyone saw them together. Or he could help her and risk bringing the attention of an entire Apache tribe to his door. The girl's hand slipped against the stone beside the water, and she closed her eyes again as if the strength had drained out of her. Daniel let out a slow breath and knelt beside her. He filled his canteen from the creek and gently lifted her head so she could drink a little water. Her eyes opened again, still cautious, but no longer filled with the same fear. Daniel knew that whatever happened next, the quiet life he had built in this valley might be about to change in ways he could not yet imagine. Daniel Carter stayed beside the creek for several minutes after giving the girl water, watching her carefully to see if the strength would return to her eyes. The young Apache girl drank slowly from the canteen, each small sip bringing a little more color back to her face. She still looked weak, but the water seemed to help her breathe more easily. Daniel glanced across the open prairie and toward the distant hills where the land stretched for miles without a single house or rider in sight. The valley was quiet, the kind of quiet that had drawn him here years ago when he wanted to live far from the trouble of towns and trails. But now that quiet felt fragile. The girl tried to sit up again, this time managing to push herself against a rock near the creek. She watched Daniel closely as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Daniel understood that look. On the frontier, trust was never given quickly, especially between strangers who came from different worlds. Daniel spoke slowly and calmly, knowing she might understand at least a few English words. He told her that she was safe and that he would help her if she allowed it. The girl said nothing at first, but her shoulders relaxed slightly, as if she sensed he meant what he said. Daniel noticed that she had likely been traveling for a long distance before reaching the creek. Dust covered her dress, and her boots were worn thin from walking. The sun was beginning to sink lower behind the ridges, and Daniel knew night would come quickly once the light disappeared from the valley. Leaving her beside the creek was not something he could do now, not when darkness would soon cover the prairie and the temperature would fall. He made his decision quietly. Daniel stood and led his horse closer to the rocks. He moved slowly so the girl would not feel threatened. After a moment of hesitation, she allowed him to help her stand. She was lighter than he expected, and the effort of simply staying on her feet seemed to exhaust her. Daniel guided her gently to the horse and helped her sit carefully on the saddle. He mounted behind her so she would not fall and turned the horse toward the ranch half a mile away. The ride back was slow. The prairie wind moved softly through the grass as the last orange light of the evening faded behind the hills. The girl remained quiet the entire time, holding the saddle horn with both hands while Daniel guided the horse along the narrow path that followed the creek toward his cabin. When the small ranch finally came into view, the lantern hanging on the porch had already begun to glow in the growing darkness. Daniel helped the girl down from the horse and guided her toward the cabin steps. For a moment she paused and looked across the valley as if thinking about something far beyond the ranch. Then she followed him inside. Daniel knew helping her might bring trouble he had never asked for. If members of her tribe believed she had been harmed near his land, they would not come quietly. Still, as he lit another lantern and brought fresh water to the table, Daniel Carter understood that leaving her beside that creek would have been something he could never forget. The cabin was warm with lantern light and the faint smell of wood smoke when Daniel Carter helped the Apache girl sit carefully in a wooden chair near the table. The small room was simple, just a stove, a narrow bed against the wall, and a rough table that Daniel had built himself years earlier. Outside, the prairie wind moved softly through the tall grass, but inside the ranch house the quiet felt steady and calm. Daniel poured fresh water into a tin cup and placed it gently in front of her. The girl held the cup with both hands and drank slowly, as if each sip helped return a little more strength to her body. Daniel could see the exhaustion in her eyes beginning to fade. He kept his voice calm and steady, speaking slowly in case she understood some of his words. He told her she could rest here until she felt strong enough to travel again. The girl listened carefully, and after a moment she nodded once, still cautious, but no longer frightened in the same way she had been beside the creek. Daniel placed a small pot on the stove and warmed a little broth he had prepared earlier that day. When the steam began to rise, he carried the bowl to the table and set it in front of her. She hesitated at first, then slowly began to eat. The warmth of the food seemed to help her regain more energy with each passing minute. Daniel stepped outside briefly to tend to the horse and secure the gate near the barn. The sky above the valley had turned deep blue, and the first stars were beginning to appear over the distant mountains. The ranch was quiet the way it always was at night, but Daniel found himself listening more carefully than usual to the distant sounds of the land. After a few minutes he returned inside and closed the door behind him. The girl had finished most of the broth and now sat quietly near the lantern light, studying the room with thoughtful eyes. Daniel noticed something about the way she observed everything around her. She was not simply resting. She was remembering details, the kind of details someone carried when they had traveled far and faced uncertainty along the way. After a moment she spoke softly, her English careful but understandable. She told him her name was Lonnie. Daniel nodded and introduced himself in return. For a short while they spoke in simple words, enough for Daniel to understand that she had been trying to reach her people somewhere beyond the western ridges when her strength failed near the creek. Lonnie looked toward the small window where the dark valley stretched quietly beyond the glass. She explained that her people would likely be searching for her. Daniel listened and slowly leaned back in his chair. He understood what that meant. If Apache riders were searching the valley, they would eventually follow signs along the creek and across the prairie. They would find the tracks that led to his ranch. Daniel did not say this aloud, but both of them seemed to understand the same truth at the same time. The quiet ranch that had been his peaceful home for years might soon become the center of a meeting neither of them could predict. Outside, the night wind moved softly across the valley, carrying with it the distant feeling that somewhere beyond the dark hills, riders might already be on their way. The lantern light inside the cabin burned steadily while the night outside the ranch deepened into silence. Daniel Carter sat near the wooden table, listening to the faint sounds carried by the prairie wind as it moved across the valley. Across from him, Lonnie rested in the chair with the warm lantern glow softening the tired lines on her face. The broth had clearly helped her regain strength, and although she still looked exhausted from travel, there was now a quiet alertness in her eyes. Daniel had spent enough years alone on the frontier to recognize when someone was listening carefully to the world around them. Lonnie was doing exactly that. After a long moment, she stood slowly and walked toward the small window beside the door. The glass reflected the lantern light, but beyond it the valley stretched dark and wide beneath the stars. Daniel rose as well and stepped beside her. The ranch yard lay quiet under the moonlight. The barn stood about 30 yards from the cabin, and beyond it the open prairie rolled toward the distant ridges where the mountains rose like dark shadows against the sky. For years Daniel had watched this same view every night, always feeling that the land itself was his closest companion. Tonight the valley felt different, as if it were waiting. Lonnie spoke softly, choosing her English words with care. She explained that when someone from her tribe disappeared during travel, the Apache did not stop searching easily. Riders would follow trails across valleys and through narrow passes until they understood what had happened. Daniel nodded slowly. He had expected as much. The tracks along the creek would not be difficult for skilled riders to follow, especially if they came through the valley after sunrise. What Daniel did not know was how they would react when they reached his ranch. The frontier held many stories of misunderstandings that grew into long and bitter conflicts. Daniel turned his eyes toward the dark prairie again and listened carefully. The wind moved softly through the tall grass, and somewhere near the creek a night bird called once before the valley returned to silence. Lonnie seemed to sense the same thing Daniel felt. Something about the night carried a quiet tension, the kind that comes before an unexpected change. Daniel placed another piece of wood into the stove, and the small flame inside the iron door brightened the room again. He told Lonnie she could rest in the cabin for the night, and that the morning would give them clearer answers. She nodded slowly and moved toward the small bed along the wall. Daniel spread a blanket across it and stepped back so she could sit down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them was not uncomfortable. It felt more like two travelers standing at the edge of a road they had not planned to walk together. Daniel returned to the chair near the door and rested his hat on the table beside him. The lantern flickered slightly as the wind brushed against the outside wall of the cabin. Somewhere far beyond the dark hills, riders might already be following the faint trail along the creek, guided by skill and determination. Daniel Carter did not know how many might come or what they would expect to find when they reached his land. But as he looked once more toward the quiet valley beyond the window, he understood that by morning the peaceful life he had known in this remote ranch might stand face to face with something far larger than he had ever imagined. Daniel Carter did not sleep much that night. He remained in the wooden chair near the door while the lantern burned low and the quiet hours passed slowly across the valley. From time to time, he stepped outside onto the small porch to listen to the prairie. The air was cool and clear beneath a sky filled with stars, and the ranch yard lay silent except for the gentle sound of wind moving through the grass. Daniel had lived alone long enough to understand how sound carried across open land. A distant rider could sometimes be heard long before he could be seen. But during those long hours of darkness, the valley remained still. When the first pale light of morning finally appeared along the eastern horizon, Daniel rose from the chair and placed fresh wood in the stove to warm the cabin again. Lonnie was already awake. She stood quietly near the window, watching the first colors of sunrise spread slowly across the prairie. The early light revealed the wide valley in soft shades of gold and gray. The creek shimmered like a narrow ribbon of silver as it wound between the rocks toward the distant hills. Daniel stepped outside and walked a short distance toward the barn. The horses were calm, shifting quietly as they waited for the day to begin. He filled a bucket with fresh water and moved through his usual morning routine, but his attention remained fixed on the open land beyond the ranch. Lonnie joined him a few minutes later, wrapped in the spare coat Daniel had given her during the night. The cool air of morning seemed to give her more strength. She stood beside the fence and looked across the valley with thoughtful eyes. Daniel noticed that she was studying the ground as well as the distant hills, the way experienced travelers often did. After a moment, she spoke softly and told him that if her people were searching, they would most likely approach through the western pass, where the hills narrowed before opening into the valley. Daniel followed her gaze toward the far ridges nearly 2 miles away. The land there rose in gentle slopes before disappearing into a narrow gap between the mountains. It was the kind of path riders would naturally follow when entering the valley from the west. The sun continued to rise higher, sending warm light across the grass and the wooden buildings of the ranch. For a short, while the morning felt almost peaceful again, Daniel fed the horses while Lonnie helped carry water from the well beside the barn. The quiet rhythm of simple work filled the early hours just as it always had. Yet both of them remained aware of the open horizon beyond the ranch. Nearly an hour passed before Lonnie suddenly paused beside the fence and narrowed her eyes toward the distant pass. Daniel followed her gaze and stood very still. At first he saw nothing except the pale hills glowing under the morning sun. Then slowly, far beyond the valley floor, faint shapes began to appear along the ridge line. They were small against the wide sky, but there were many of them. As the riders moved forward into the light, the shapes became clearer. Horsemen were entering the valley in a long line that stretched across the western pass. The distance was still great, but the number of riders was unmistakable. Daniel Carter rested his hands on the wooden fence and watched silently. The peaceful morning he had known for years was now changing before his eyes. Somewhere across the open prairie, an entire Apache tribe had begun riding toward his ranch. Daniel Carter stood beside the fence with the morning sun rising behind him while the long line of riders slowly descended from the western pass into the valley. From this distance, they looked like small moving shadows across the pale hills, but their number was impossible to mistake. The riders stretched across the ridge like a living line that continued to grow as more horses appeared behind the first group. Lonnie watched quietly beside him, her expression calm but focused as she studied the approaching figures. The early light spread across the prairie, revealing more detail with every passing minute. The horses moved at a steady pace, not rushing but not stopping either, following a path that angled directly toward the wide center of the valley where Daniel's ranch stood alone. Daniel had seen small groups of riders cross distant land before, travelers moving along trails or cattle hands guiding herds between settlements. But this was different. The riders were organized, their formation loose but purposeful, as if they all understood the same destination without needing to speak it aloud. Daniel rested his arms on the top rail of the wooden fence and continued watching. He estimated the distance to be a little more than 1.5 miles from the ranch to the western pass, which meant the riders would reach the valley floor within an hour if they kept their pace. Lonnie spoke quietly and told him that her people often traveled this way when searching for someone important. Riders would spread across the land to read the signs left by hooves, footsteps, and broken grass. Once the direction became clear, the entire group would follow the same trail until they reached its end. Daniel nodded slowly as he listened. The path along the creek that led toward his ranch would have been easy for skilled trackers to follow. The valley floor held soft earth near the water, and the marks left by a horse carrying 2 riders would stand out clearly to anyone trained to see them. Daniel glanced toward the cabin and the small barn beside it. The ranch buildings looked small beneath the wide sky, nothing more than a few wooden structures surrounded by miles of open land. For years that isolation had been a comfort. Now it meant there was nowhere to hide and nowhere to go without being seen. The riders continued descending into the valley, their shapes growing clearer against the brightening grass. Daniel could now distinguish individual horses moving through the morning light. Some carried riders wearing long, feathered headpieces that shifted slightly in the wind. Others rode bareheaded but upright with the quiet confidence of people who knew this land well. Lonnie watched them with a mixture of relief and concern. She explained that when her tribe searched for someone who had not returned, they did not stop until they had answers. Daniel understood what that meant. The riders were not passing through the valley. They were coming here. The distance slowly shortened as the riders reached the lower slopes and began crossing the wide prairie that led directly toward the ranch. The quiet morning work Daniel had started earlier now felt like something from another life. He removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair while keeping his eyes on the approaching line of horses. The valley that had once been silent now held the sound of many hooves moving steadily across the open grass. And with every minute that passed, the riders of the Apache tribe drew closer to the small ranch where Daniel Carter and the girl they had been searching for stood waiting. Daniel Carter remained beside the fence as the riders continued across the open prairie, their steady movement slowly transforming the quiet valley into a place filled with purpose. The morning sun climbed higher behind the eastern ridge, casting long shadows across the grass, while the approaching line of horsemen spread wider as they descended fully onto the valley floor. From this closer distance, Daniel could now count dozens of riders, perhaps even more than 100, all moving with the same calm determination. None of them appeared rushed. Their pace was steady and deliberate, as if they had traveled far, but were confident they had finally reached the place they were searching for. Lonnie stood quietly near the gate beside him. Her eyes followed the riders carefully, studying faces and clothing as if she might recognize someone among them. Daniel noticed the change in her expression when the riders came closer. The tension that had rested on her shoulders since the night before began to ease slightly. She pointed toward the front of the approaching line where a tall rider guided a dark horse across the prairie with calm authority. The man rode slightly ahead of the others, not racing forward, but clearly leading the movement of the group behind him. Lonnie explained softly that the rider was likely one of the respected leaders of her people, someone trusted to guide the search. Daniel watched the leader carefully. Even from this distance, the rider carried himself with a calm presence that drew attention. The horse moved smoothly beneath him, while the long line of riders followed in a wide arc that gradually angled toward the ranch buildings. Daniel felt the quiet weight of the moment settle over the land. The small ranch that had once seemed hidden from the world was now the center of attention for an entire tribe of riders crossing the prairie. The sound of hooves grew more noticeable as the distance continued to shrink. The riders had reached a point less than half a mile away now, their horses moving through the tall grass that swayed gently in the morning breeze. Daniel removed his hat again and rested it against the fence rail while keeping his eyes on the approaching leader. He had no intention of running or hiding. The truth of what had happened was simple. He had found the girl beside the creek and helped her when she needed it. Still, he understood that strangers meeting on the frontier could easily misunderstand one another if fear or suspicion took control of the moment. Lonnie stepped slightly ahead of him near the open gate and lifted her hand toward the riders. Her posture was calm but strong, and Daniel realized she was preparing to greet them openly so they would see that she was safe. The leader at the front of the line seemed to notice her movement almost immediately. The dark horse slowed, and the riders behind him gradually reduced their pace as well. The wide formation of horsemen began to tighten as they approached the ranch, spreading across the prairie in a broad semicircle that stopped a short distance from the fence line. Dust from the horses drifted softly through the morning air, while the valley, which had once been silent, now held the presence of many watchful eyes. Daniel Carter stood beside Lonnie and waited. In the quiet space between the two sides of the fence, the riders of the Apache tribe had finally reached the place where their search would end. The valley remained silent for several long moments after the riders stopped. The wide semicircle of Apache horsemen stood across the prairie facing the small ranch, while the morning sun continued to rise behind the hills. Dust from the long ride drifted slowly through the air before settling back onto the grass. Daniel Carter kept his hands resting calmly on the top rail of the wooden fence. Beside him, Lonnie stepped forward through the open gate and walked several feet into the open space between the ranch and the waiting riders. Her movement drew immediate attention. Several riders shifted slightly in their saddles as they watched her approach the center of the field. The tall leader riding the dark horse guided his mount a few steps forward from the line. The horse moved with quiet confidence, stopping about 20 yards from where Lonnie stood. From this closer distance, Daniel could see the rider clearly for the first time. The man looked older than most of the others, perhaps in his late 50s, with calm eyes that seemed to study everything around him before reacting. Feathers moved gently behind his head as the morning breeze crossed the valley. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lonnie raised both hands slightly in greeting and spoke in her own language. Her voice carried clearly across the quiet prairie. As she spoke, the tension among the riders softened in a way that Daniel could see even from the fence. Several of the men exchanged glances and lowered their shoulders, as if the words she spoke had brought relief to the entire group. The leader listened carefully before guiding his horse a little closer. He replied calmly, his voice steady and deep. Although Daniel did not understand the language, the tone of the exchange did not carry anger or accusation. It sounded more like confirmation, as if the leader had finally received the answer he had been searching for. Lonnie turned slightly and gestured back toward the ranch. Her hand pointed directly toward Daniel, standing beside the fence. Every rider in the semicircle shifted their attention in the same direction. For the first time, Daniel Carter found himself facing the full attention of more than 100 Apache riders gathered across the prairie. He remained still, his posture open and steady, showing that he had nothing to hide. Lonnie spoke again, this time with more emotion in her voice as she explained what had happened beside the creek the night before. The leader listened without interrupting. When she finished speaking, the older rider turned his eyes toward Daniel and studied him carefully for several long seconds. The valley seemed to grow even quieter during that pause. Then the leader slowly dismounted from his horse and stepped onto the prairie grass. The simple gesture caused a ripple of movement through the riders behind him, but none of them followed his example. He walked forward alone across the short distance toward the ranch fence where Daniel waited. The two men stopped only a few feet apart with the wooden rails between them. The leader placed one hand over his chest in a gesture of respect before speaking in careful English that carried the weight of experience. He said that the tribe had followed the trail of their missing daughter across many miles of land, and that they had come prepared to face whatever truth awaited them here. Then he looked directly into Daniel Carter's eyes and said something that Daniel had not expected to hear. He said that by morning the entire tribe had already learned the name of the man who had chosen to help one of their own when she needed it most. Daniel Carter stood quietly at the fence while the Apache leader finished speaking. The words settled into the morning air like something heavier than the dust drifting across the prairie. Behind the leader, more than 100 riders waited in still silence, watching the exchange between the two men. Daniel felt the weight of their attention, but did not look away. He had spent many years alone in this valley, learning that respect often began with simple honesty. The leader studied Daniel for another moment before continuing in careful English. He explained that Lonnie was the daughter of a respected family within the tribe and that her disappearance had brought great concern among her people. Riders had been sent across valleys, along rivers, and through distant passes to search for her trail. When they discovered her tracks near the creek and saw that another set of tracks led toward the ranch, they followed without stopping. The leader glanced briefly toward Lonnie, who now stood calmly near the open gate. Her shoulders relaxed in a way they had not been the night before. Daniel understood that her safety had already changed the meaning of this meeting. The leader placed one hand on the fence rail between them, not as a barrier, but as a quiet gesture of connection. He said that on the frontier, Stories of kindness often traveled slower than stories of conflict. Yet this time the news had moved quickly through the riders of the tribe. By the time they reached the valley, many of them already knew that a rancher had chosen to help a young Apache girl instead of turning away. Daniel shifted his hat slightly in his hands, unsure what to say to such words. He had not acted to earn recognition. He had simply done what he believed was right in that moment beside the creek. The leader seemed to understand this without needing to hear it spoken. He gave a small nod and stepped back from the fence before raising his hand toward the waiting riders. A quiet murmur passed through the semicircle of horsemen, not loud, but strong enough to carry across the prairie. The tension that had filled the valley earlier that morning now softened into something closer to respect. Lonnie walked forward and stood beside Daniel, her eyes bright in the sunlight. She spoke quietly to the leader again, explaining how Daniel had found her and brought her safely to the ranch. When she finished, the older man smiled slightly, the kind of expression that comes from relief after a long search finally ends. He turned once more to Daniel and said that the tribe would remember the man who had shown kindness when it mattered most. The riders slowly began turning their horses back toward the western pass, their search complete. Within minutes, the long line of riders began moving again across the prairie, their figures gradually spreading out across the wide valley as they prepared for the journey home. Daniel and Lonnie stood beside the fence watching them ride away. The land slowly returned to quiet as the sound of hooves faded into the distance. The ranch that had seemed so small beneath the morning sky now felt connected to something much larger than Daniel had ever expected. And as the last riders disappeared beyond the distant hills, Daniel Carter realized that the valley he once believed had forgotten him had quietly become a place where a single act of kindness would be remembered for many years to come.